All right. Well, I think before we jump in, why don't we have a quick word of prayer? Okay. Dear my Father, Lord, thank you so much for today. Thank you for your creation, and as we study it today, help us to see you in your world, and just all the different things that you've done for us as evidence for you as our Creator. In your holy name, Amen. So before we jump into the topic today, there was a few questions that got brought up last time, and so I thought I would address a few of those. One of those was around Noah's Ark, and we're going to talk some about the flood today. But one of the things that was brought up was how did all the animals fit in the ark? And if you've been to the Ark Encounter, if you haven't been there, it's pretty amazing. But they actually have a whole area about this, and they talk about some of the details of the animals. So one of the things that's brought up is the kinds of animals on the ark. And so this word kind is a broader definition than what we talk about today with like species. So if you looked at how many different species of animals there are, there's over 1 million different types of species of animals. And I could probably say, could you name a few different like mammals? Like what are some mammals? Like you could name, a whale or a kangaroo or something like that. And so these different animals have all these different things here, but the kind is bigger. So usually in the world of kinds, it's the animals that can reproduce together. So there's certain animals that cannot reproduce together. So if we think about dogs, like when we have all these different hybrid dogs now, like you have a Labradoodle and a Schnooberdoodle and whatever doodles you want to do, because they like to mix doodle in there. But it's because any type of dog can actually breed with another type of dog, and then you can create a new dog, and then they have new genetic features and all these different things. But then if you think about like, well, can a dog and a cow like reproduce? Like no, like their genetic code doesn't work. So they're different kinds of animals. But if you took like a cow and maybe a bison, they're probably close enough that they could probably reproduce together. So these different types of things are kind of what we think about as a kind. And if you went down the way that we name different animals, you start at like a kingdom, and then a phylum, and an order, family, genus, species. If you go back to science class, sorry for those of you who don't like science, but this is going to be sciencey heavy today, and I like it. So I think it's a lot of fun. That's right. So usually we think about like as a family or an order of what these kinds were. So those kind of bigger things, like if I said, hey, name an animal, you're probably going to say dog. You're not going to say like a German Shepherd. Well, I mean, you might, but again, you're thinking about those broader categories. So then after the flood, they think that those kinds were able to have some genetic diversity and become these other animals. So here's a kind of a quick chart that looks at what the estimates of the number of species were. So it's nice because it actually breaks it down to like amphibians and mammals and birds, different things as well. So, we know some birds were on the ark. We don't know, like, I doubt that there was any like water animals because the whole world was now water. But they think around 7,000, so 6,700 if you get really specific around that, of how many animals have to be on there. So how is that doable if you need 6,000 animals? So think about today's modern zoo. And not even just that, but like think about like a kennel or something where there's all these different things that you're not trying to keep them in their natural environment like a zoo. You don't need all the space. You probably kept them in some cages. And if you looked at the size of the ark, there's actually 1.5 million cubic feet. So you guys probably, some of you might have driven by that Amazon factory or warehouse over there. And that's probably not even close to 1 million square feet. Like most warehouses are under 1 million square feet. So if you could imagine 1.5 million square feet, it's probably maybe 2 of those Amazon warehouses. And you could probably imagine like keeping a lot of animals in those. So it's also equivalent to about 500 railroad cars. So if imagine you had a really long train of 500 cars. We like to sit at the train tracks and count them when they go by. But most trains are not even close to 500 cars. They're probably on the scale of like 50 to 100, sometimes going over 100. So, so if you think about it too, like there is the different heights, the different layers, levels, and they think that there was about 100,000 kind of square feet. And so there's a lot of different things there that you can have there. So which, sorry, I misspoke a little bit. So that's cubic feet. I was thinking about the warehouse was square feet. So my apologies. But so with that, the big thing here is like, well, what is the size of animals? So you don't need to get a giant elephant and bring them on the ark. Like, what if you got the little cute little guys, like the baby elephants, come on. And if you think about the average size of an animal, most sized animals are about the, if you were to average them, so you took all the animals in the world, all the different kinds of animals, they're about the size of a sheep. So that would be the average size. And then, so even, because most of you think about like, well, what are the most animals that you think about? Insects is the largest number of animals that we actually have. And so then they're tiny, they're not like most of our large animals, you could probably name them off, like the land animals, like you got giraffes and rhinos and hippos, and but like what else is bigger than those things? Like there's not much. So a lot of these animals are really small, and if you got the baby forms, it's okay too. Plus, I also believe in miracles, and I think that God could also put these animals into like a hibernation, just like bears do, where they could be sleeping most of the time or need very little energy as well. Did you have something real?
And they don't need to poop.
And they don't need to poop. Yeah, in hibernation, that's right. They kind of store it for 6 months. Yeah.
Wait, how long were they on the ark?
It was about a year.
Oh.
Yeah, so it was about a year on the ark. Yeah, it's a long time.
Well, then they were building the ark for mankind too, right? So the space was for people.
Yeah.
They were hoping more people would come too.
Yeah. So based on the size, they think that about 60 to 70-ish% of the space was being used. So there was still room for people to come and join on the ark. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if you have a chance to go to the Ark Encounter, it's going to break this down even more, but it's pretty fun to look at that. The next thing that was brought up, and Matt was telling me that somebody came and presented this a while ago here, several years ago, around polonium halos. And so if you're not familiar with this, we're going to dive a little bit into it. It's a little more sciencey, but basically you have the periodic table of elements, and I'm not going to teach you what this is, but it's an amazing table. But this one down here, so polonium. So most of the things down here are you're like uranium is radioactive, and so polonium is not any different. It gives off some radiation called alpha radiation. And why is that important? So this really kind of identifies things in granite. So most of you probably have this in your kitchen or know somebody that does. But granite was thought to be over millions of years, like it being made. However, these polonium halos kind of suggest that this is not the case. So you can kind of see like there's a little speck here, and these are radiating these circles, and these circles you can actually identify in the rock with like microscopy and different things. And these circles are basically like how the energy was distributed. And if you were to study these based on like, if I were to say, okay, these circles are uranium, I could say I know that this is uranium based on how the circles are distributed, like the distance from the middle and the different sizes, the numbers of the circles, all those things we can say that's uranium, or you could put something else and say, oh, that's plutonium. And so we know that this is polonium because of how the circles are distributed, if that makes sense. So the evolutionist take is that it takes millions of years. So there's this kind of molten rock, 1,000 degrees Celsius, which is really hot, and then it kind of slowly works its way to the Earth's surface, and then it cools and cools and cools over millennia, and so it can't be created very quickly. However, these polonium halos suggest that it could be. So it's again this kind of slow thing. If it cooled too quickly, it doesn't form granite. It actually forms a different type of rock, like basalt, that you might have heard of as well. So the polonium halos suggest that it could be quick because these are very short, what we call half-lives. So you guys are hopefully familiar with the idea of a half-life. So if you have 100% of something over, let's pick, so this polonium-210 has a half-life of 138 days. So 138 days, now you're going to only have half of it is polonium. And then after another 138 days, now you're going to have 25%. And then another 25 days, you're going to have 12.5%. So it just keeps getting halved every 138 days. So if that was the case in the molten rock, these don't form. But the half-life is so short that the polonium shouldn't be in the rock anymore. It should have already decayed, is where this really comes from. So that's why it's an amazing thing to kind of study these halos in rock that's supposed to be millions of years old. Like these halos shouldn't be there because there's no uranium that's around this. So sometimes you can actually put two things together, and polonium can come from uranium, but there's no uranium around these polonium halos. It's just polonium by itself. And so they're like, how did things that took millions of years to form, like granite, have these halos that don't last more than a year? It doesn't make any sense. So it's kind of, again, suggesting that God can create things instantly. So again, not proof, but I think more evidence. And I think that goes along with Romans 10 or 1:20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. And I think when I think about those polonium halos, it's something invisible to my naked eye, but as we learn more and more about science and we start studying these things, we kind of see his invisible attributes and the things that he has made throughout creation.
And they're finding more of that in fossils as well, too. They're finding more and more soft tissue and a lot of cancer fossils. They think, there can't be, there's marrow and stuff.
I know, we're getting there. Yeah, we're getting there. So, very good, Tim. You're ahead of me. So with that, as we jump into science, can we trust science? This is really the process that we want to talk about today. And talk about science as a process. I think that's an important thing to understand. So what science is designed to do, and I tried to highlight the words here in red for your cheat sheets. And if I missed one, I apologize. But so science is a method of studying the natural world through observation, measurement, experimentation, and repeatability. Because as we think about science today, we need to be able to repeat what we're doing. If you can't repeat a study, then people think that you probably fudged on the study. And it's actually been the case on several different major scientific papers that people were kind of fudging their data because they wanted a good outcome. They had this bias that's saying, I'm going to make this happen no matter what. So that's why repeatability is something that we see over and over in our research today. So what science cannot do is that it can't explain the metaphysical or things beyond the physical world. It can't explain things like why we exist at all, like we talked about in the first series. And it can't explain the laws of nature, like why are the laws here in the first place. Beyond this natural world, what was before the Big Bang, there's lots of theories around that, but we can't explain it. Science cannot also explain morality. You can get into philosophy and things like that to kind of understand, but you can't have science explain that this is good and this is bad. Science just is. So these are kind of key points to think about as we think about, like, science is designed to look at the natural world and make observations based on experiments and measurements and then be able to repeat that. But then there's kind of this methodological naturalism. So I'm going to talk about two things. There's kind of the philosophical naturalism, and then there's the methodological naturalism. The two parts here, so science limits itself to natural causes when conducting experiments. So this is a practical rule. It's not a philosophical claim. And what I mean by that is that it's not saying that there's only nature and that God does not exist. So to put it in a different analogy here is that there's a metal detectors cannot detect plastic because it's not designed to detect plastic, but it can detect metal. So you have to kind of stay within your framework, and that's what science is. Like, science can study the natural world because that's what we have to study. We can look at all the things in our nature. We can look at, light. We can look at matter. We can look at energy. We can look at how they interact together. Because we're studying the natural world, our answers need to be natural as well. But it doesn't exclude that there's some supernatural component to it. And Max Planck, who's a famous physicist, he said, the scientific method is absolutely powerless when it comes to questions about the ultimate nature of reality. And I like that because as we think about the ultimate nature of reality, we're thinking, well, where is our life? Like, where are we heading in our lives? And so I think it's important to study what are these different views because it influences how we look at the outcomes of science. Because really there changes into this philosophical naturalism, and people, a lot of naturalists or materialists think that their philosophical naturalism is the same thing as the methodologic naturalism. Because they say, well, science can only study material and energy, so that means that's all there is. But that is now shifting from science into what you believe. It's a worldview. So a worldview is not a scientific conclusion. Just because we can only study the natural world doesn't mean that there's only a natural world. So only matter and energy exist is what the philosophical naturalism is. So hopefully you can kind of see those distinctions between that kind of methodological perspective and the physiological, or the the psychological part. There we go. So this is basically saying there is no God, there's no soul, there's no ultimate purpose. Philosophical argument. Thank you. So with that, I hope you understand that science and faith are not enemies. They can work together because science is looking at the natural world, and I think it can show us that there are things that we can't understand, like what we talked about in the very first night. But it can also help us understand what we are. And there's actually a number of foundational scientists that believe that the natural world is orderly because it was designed. And even Einstein himself, he kind of has an interesting view of God in itself, but as he studied the world and the universe more and more, came to the conclusions that there must be some type of designer. He was more kind of an agnostic, like God kind of started it and just kind of let it run, but he just said you can't understand how everything is so perfectly designed. So as we get into studying this a little bit more, it's important to understand some biases. So one here is that there's a problem as we study anything in our life, that we have this belief bias. And this indicates that we tend to accept things that fit our own belief system. So as you're looking at a variety of different things, there's different viewpoints. So I'm going to give you a quick example of just what I mean by belief bias. So if I had an empty cup in the back of the room, you could say, well, we just had all these people here. I bet somebody took a drink and then left it over there, and then it's empty because somebody drank out of it. Well, the other view is that maybe it was always empty and there was never anything in the cup and then somebody left it there. Or maybe there was a view that it actually formed out of nothing and it just became this materialist thing in the back of the room because that's how its atoms joined together and it just happened to be there by chance. So these all kind of bring this worldview, like some of your background, some of your philosophy, some of your thoughts around supernatural things, and how you explain things in the future. So we'll kind of see this a little bit more as we study things. So one of the things is we look at creationist bias now, and I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about how the evolutionists get frustrated with creationists and materialists get frustrated with us, is that the creationists are dealing with these complex systems and difficult things, and they just say, well, God can be the only explanation. There's no other explanation. Or God made it that way, or God can do anything. And then, so it's kind of like a hard stop. And I think the problem that I have with some of these things as we study just the scientific world is I don't want to just stop there. I think we always need to kind of be looking for what's happening and where did this come from. And because it does kind of limit your worldview. I'm not saying that you have to exclude things, but I think there are things that these are the best explanations, and God said this is what was described in the Bible, and he tells us that. But at the same time, like, don't just get to a point and say, that's it. There is things in science that are very true and very accurate. However, the opposite is also true, where there's this materialist or the naturalist view bias, and basically it's the same thing, but now it's kind of saying that, well, if I had enough time, chance could make it happen. So that's kind of their cop-out. So ours is like, they feel our cop-out is God, and their cop-out is time. So they just say, well, as long as we have enough time, it could happen. If we have enough chances, you're gonna roll the dice and it's gonna work. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind, because as we look at a few different things in science today, there's two major different worldviews that are competing, and they have these very distinct differences. But these are the two things that, like, one is a very biblical worldview that God tells us what happened, and one is saying that, no, if we had enough time and chance, this could happen as well. But I think it's also important to highlight, so I think in 2 Peter 3:3-6, it says, first of all, you must understand that the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, where is this coming he promised? Ever since our fathers died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation. But they deliberately forget that long ago God's word for the heavens existed, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. By these waters, also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. So I think as we look at where we are now today, there's definitely lots of different viewpoints. And actually, interesting, a lot of these viewpoints were happening around 1844, which is a significant event. And and these evolutionist ideas around the world is much smaller than we think, and these floods that happened are not on a global scale, are kind of challenging this viewpoint of God. And 2 Peter tells us that this was going to be the nature in the last days, and we definitely see that today. So with that, I wanted to jump into the flood, as we just talked about how, God destroyed the world with a flood, and I think that the Genesis record is a historical record, and it's very accurate based on what we've seen in the world today and our interpretation of it. But interestingly enough, this global flood tradition is across cultures. So there's about 200 different ancient cultures that contain flood traditions that share core elements. So there's a divine judgment, a favored survivor family, a vessel, animals preserved, post-flood repopulation. So not all of those are in every single story, but there's some that are very accurate, like that go very into detail around the family, even the number of people. And there's mixtures of things, like one even story, it wasn't a vessel, like they jumped on a big turtle or something like that. So there are some variability amongst the story. But the point is that this is actually a picture. There's a website that looks at where all these different stories are, and you can actually click on the little red dots, and it'll actually bring up where the story is from and where what the story is, and gives you more detail. So if you want to look it up on your own, it's a really neat. Just Google, global flood story traditions around the world. It'll be like in the first 5, then you can just click on them. And it's amazing though, because you would think like, well, if this was a flood story in just the Middle East, then they would just be consolidated there. But even look over here, we have lots of stories even in the Americas that are way far away from that over here. And so I think to me it just shows that there's something on a global scale that's happening if everybody is talking about this global flood in these historical cultures. Another amazing thing is that there's also these Eastern cultures. So Chinese word for boat or ship is actually, I don't know if anybody's seen this before, but these kind of 3 symbols is actually a vessel and 8 people. Is how this is designed. And I thought this was really fascinating, that it's like the combination of these words is actually telling the story of the boat, the ark in itself. I think it's a vessel. It could also be like the vessel and 8 mouths, I think, is another interpretation. But I think it's pretty incredible that this even is built into the language. So Tim did a nice job of giving a preamble to some of the fossils, and so I think as we talk about this, so fossils, interestingly enough, they require this rapid burial. It's not a slow accumulation. So that's why we don't have lots of fossils like on the ground outside. There's probably animals that have died all over the world, but they decompose and they get eaten by other animals and insects, and but these that are fossils were rapidly buried, so they didn't undergo decomposition, but with the pressure, and they also need some pressure environment, with that covering to turn them into stone, into a fossil, so it's not like they can just decompose underneath the earth. But we find fully articulated skeletons. So, I mean, you can go to most, like natural science museums, and you'll see these massive skeletons of like the T-Rex and the Triceratops and things like that. And you can see that they don't look all that great when they're in the dirt, because they got jumbled up a little bit, but then they can articulate them and put them together. And then there's also you mentioned the soft tissue. We'll talk about that in a second, but we're seeing some of those details as well. And then also these rapidly buried marine organisms, so things that are in seas and oceans, are even found on mountaintops. And I think to me that's an amazing thing, that it's like, because it's consistent again with that Genesis worldview. So in the last few years, they've been studying more and more fossils, and they found that some of these fossils have actually soft tissue remnants in them, and this is actually a little red cell that they found as well within the vein of a blood vessel of a fossil, and these are supposedly 160 million years old, and they shouldn't. Science is trying to explain like why these soft tissues are there, because they shouldn't be if they're that old, and we see a lot of those things, and the one thing with science too, as we find things that are unexplainable, people are going to find an explanation to fit their worldview on both sides of the argument. Like that's our kind of MO, is that we want to fit things into our impressions. And then this is another area that I find interesting. So these are actually small fossils that were found on Mount Everest near the summit. So this is 29,000 feet up in the air. This is miles and miles up. And there's still marine fossils that are found up at that height. And they think that part of it is because the mountain range was brought up by the two continents kind of colliding together. But I think it's still fascinating to know that they're that high up in the mountains. So with that, as a big flood happens, there's these. They think that there's these large sedimentary layers. So, example of sediment, you can kind of see, like if you've been to the Grand Canyon, which I got a picture a little bit later, it shows you these different kind of layers. They're different colors, different materials in there. And they're also rapidly deposited beds. So it has minimally erosion, and partly because if you look at the beds here, so everything kind of above this line here, everything is pretty flat. So there's no big jagged things. So if I want you to think about the Grand Canyon, you can see these big cuts because it's eroded away. However, when you look at these big sheets of sediment rock, there's no up and down. There's no jaggedness. And a lot of these people think that, well, these layers were deposited over millions of years. Well, if you had millions of years, why wouldn't we see the erosion that we see today? Because even today, even just the Grand Canyon has this massive cut in it, but we don't see that throughout these massive sedimentary layers. So to give you just a kind of a quick review of some of these things, is like how we're learning in modern day where these sedimentary layers can come from is this Mount St. Helens. So in 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted. It was one of the largest natural disasters in modern history. It was about 20 megatons of TNT, and it was just this huge explosion of ash that blew up. The whole side of the mountain even kind of caved away. But then immediately after that, over the next few years, scientists started studying what was happening to the geological layers around there. And they found that just like in the sedimentary rock we see like in the Grand Canyon, they started seeing these layering effects over just a few years after the Mount St. Helens exploded. And it's actually very clear, even in this one, like this is actually a collection of like material from like trees, so like sticks and that kind of stuff, and it's all kind of grouped together, and it's not everywhere around, but there was a lot of water flows. The other thing is that Mount St. Helens also erupted a couple of years later. It was 1982, and then deposited even more layers, so you can kind of see this stacking things, but you can kind of see here where it's a nice smooth line. We're not seeing a lot of erosion into these things as well, so it was very consistent with what people were seeing in these sedimentary layers across the U.S. and other continents. The other thing they found was it kind of helps us understand what's called polystrate fossils. So these are trees that are actually standing up in these different strata, so different layers. And people were trying to understand, one, why is a tree standing upright and then fossilized? Because if these different layers were supposed to be millions of years apart, how could one tree be lasting millions of years and then be fossilized? And what they found in Mount St. Helens was that there was a Spirit Lake, and Spirit Lake had all these trees that would just got blown over by the explosion of the volcano. And at first they were kind of laying on the water and just kind of floating as a big raft. But then over time, as they became more waterlogged, they actually would shift with their roots being down, and it would stand up just like these trees and these polystrates. And you can kind of see here at the bottom of the lake, there were still being deposits from different eruptions, and even as the sediment would also come in, it would start to layer just like these would. And so now we kind of see that these trees were laid down not over millions of years, but in a very quick, like massive destructive event that had a very similar effect to what we saw on Mount St. Helens as well. So this is kind of the, I took this off of Nova, if you've ever seen some of those videos, but this was kind of a layering effect of what they say, how long these different events occurred. And you can kind of see these different layers within the Grand Canyon, kind of these different colors are associated with different years. So as we talk about sediments, like I just mentioned Mount St. Helens, that was a local event. It was definitely a large disaster, but it still wasn't a global event. But it gives us kind of some insight into a global effect of a massive global event. So what would a global event look like? I think as we look at the U.S. as a whole, I want to show you just a quick picture. This is from a video series called Is Genesis History? And they do a nice job of kind of laying out different geological findings and biological findings that support creation and the biblical worldview. And this is one of the pictures from that. And this area here is called a mega sequence. And this is one of those sedimentary layers. And you can see these other lines here. So this is another mega sequence, another one underneath that, another one underneath that. These sequences that we see in the Grand Canyon, which is all the way over here, actually goes over almost the entire United States. Like, that's how big these sedimentary layers are occurring. And what a lot of people say in in the materialist worldview is that there was a big ocean. It was a shallow ocean, but the ocean actually went over the entire United States. And that ocean laid down a bunch of sediment, and then the ocean retreated. And then the ocean went back up and laid down another layer of sediment a few million years later, and then it retreated. And then the ocean went back up over the United States, and then and so it did this 17 different times, because there's big layers all throughout the United States. But then at the same time, it's like, this is a massive amount of material, if you think about it. Like, this is not just a little bit of material. Like, some of these sequences are hundreds or thousands of feet thick that is being deposited over almost the entire United States. The other amazing thing is that it's not just over the United States. Like, these mega sequences have been correlated globally. Like, it's a widespread continuity. There's sedimentary layers over across continents, so North America, Africa, Australia. These are global, not just local. And you can see these are different ones that are kind of named, like the Salk and the Tippecanoe, the Zuni, which are fun names. But these are also correlated with ones that are still in Brazil, and this is actually in Russia, and this is Western Canada. So these actually have different depths, but it's the entire world, so I don't expect them to be the same depth. But at the same time, they're very consistent throughout the entire world, that there's these sedimentary layers, which I think, to me, also points to a global flood. The interesting thing too is, like, so below these sedimentary layers, as you can see, like, that were laid down, is there's what's called this great unconformity, and you can kind of see in this picture over here where these arrows are. And again, if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, or probably one of the better spots to see it is if you ever go to the Black Canyon in Colorado, you can kind of see this huge granite block underneath. And a lot of that, again, we talked about granite earlier, that granite's supposed to take millions and millions of years to form. It's a very slow process. But it's created very differently than a lot of these other sedimentary layers. And the granite itself kind of forms this, most of the time granite forms this unconformity layer. And this layer is, again, across the world. It's not just in one area or not. It's seen in multiple different continents. So with that is, like, how do we get these dating things? I think that comes up a lot, and a lot of questions around dating. We talk about carbon dating, which we'll talk a little bit about, but carbon dating isn't really used for rocks because it's too short. That half-life, like we talked about, is a few thousand years, and if this worldview is explaining that rocks are millions of years old, we need something that's going to last a little longer. There's kind of these sedimentary rocks are not dated usually directly, but it's called indirectly. So we're using materials associated with them, so like volcanic ash, and then you're also using different types of isotopes. You can also use one that's the law of superposition, so basically that the bottom layer is going to be, it has to be older than the top layer, because you can't stack things in reverse order, and so it's kind of like a law of logic that the oldest thing is on the bottom. So to kind of give you an idea here, so like how old are rocks, there is this kind of, some people say it's circular reasoning, but the sedimentary rocks are dated by fossils and fossils are dated by the rocks. And some of that is true because they're using kind of that worldview, but they also look at these different volcanic rocks. And the volcanic rocks, they think, well, if it's volcanic, then it came from the Earth's core, and so then they have more stability within them. But they use these highly variable techniques. So just like with carbon dating, you can use argon or uranium or radon or lots of different things here, but it's very specific within 5,000 to 6 billion years. So, it's kind of hard to get a good time scale, and the time scales are very variable as well. And we'll talk about why there's probably some problems with any types of these datings, and really the dating methods that we use depend highly on these kind of half-lives. So again, that half-life material, so this is uranium, or carbon. So carbon dating would be like age 0, there's 100% of carbon 14, and then at 5,730 years later, there's 50%, 25%, 12.5, and then just kind of keeps going smaller and smaller and smaller. So the problem is that, let's say, if there was a fossil, like a log that fell underneath something, and then it had carbon-14 in it, and then let's say it is 1 million years old, like how much would there be left? It would be very, 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 very minuscule. So that's where it becomes difficult, because you have to have very precise measurement tools to be able to identify where these carbon-14 atoms are from. And even just a slight movement of that carbon-14 is then going to change it to be much older or much younger. So. And this is kind of how quickly, I'm not going to get into all the science, but how carbon-14 happens. There's some sun that hits some nitrogen, and then that nitrogen kicks off a proton, and then that proton combines with some carbon, and then the carbon gets from carbon-12 to carbon-14, and so it just have this, and then eventually it decays over time, and then you get some radiation that comes out. So I'm just going to wave my hands and say that's how it's done. All right. So, but with radiometric dating, there's lots of assumptions, okay? So the assumptions that we make, can definitely affect the outcomes. And so the first thing is that there's constant decay rates. So it's never been disproven that there's different decay rates. So it's always around that 4,000 year timeline. But what if it was different in the past? What if there was any differences, from the physics of that? And then the other thing is that the initial conditions, and that ties into some of these things down here, so that carbon-14 is evenly distributed. So right now there's a balance in the atmosphere of carbon-14 and in the atmosphere to what's being created and what's being degraded. But what if that balance was not the same pre-flood? And what if that balance wasn't constant? The Earth's atmosphere has also been the same. We think that the atmosphere was different probably prior to the flood. And then there's also no contamination or alteration. And it's interesting, as I've studied some of these things in science, that people do alter data to fit that worldview, or they say even what we call an error, where it's like, well, this gives you a 5,000 time frame, but there's an error of 10,000, and so it's like, well, how accurate is that? So there are several different assumptions as we get into radiometric dating. I think that in studying like carbon-14, there are things that are used like within the last couple hundred or thousands of years that it could be helpful for. Like we date, like we talked about some of the papers and the scrolls that are being used, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They can use carbon-14 to date those because they were made in the last few hundred years, so that can kind of give us an earlier time frame and a more accurate. But as you get into more of those expected longer durations, it becomes less and less accurate. And here's a good example of that. So there are some scientists from that same video as Genesis History that they took the same rock samples. They took samples from all over the world, and they sent them to different testing facilities, and then they said, how old are these rocks? And so they looked at potassium, argon, and rubidium and things. And so one said this one is 516 million years old. This one says it's 1.5 billion years old. So that error rate is over 1 billion years. years based on the dating techniques. So again, I don't know how accurate you want your testing to be, but a billion years to me doesn't sound very good. So I don't know how you do on school if you were a billion off, but. So I think with that, I think it's again kind of consistent with Psalms 104. You've covered it with the deep as with a garment. The wood stood above, or the water stood above the mountains. They went up by the mountains and they went down by the valleys. And this is actually, as you read the Bible and you have this kind of creation thought process and you think about the flood, like we're seeing things like the fossils on mountains, but also as the waters rush through the valleys, almost, I want to say almost none, very few or fewer scientists believe that the Grand Canyon took millions of years to carve out now. The more common theory now, even just when I was a kid, it said, oh, that was millions of years that the Colorado River cut it out. Almost nobody believes that because of how they've studied it, and they've seen that these sedimentary layers were probably wet at the time of deposition, and then that there was probably these larger lakes that broke, and as the lakes broke, or as the floodwaters receded, it washed the Grand Canyon out. And that's the more common accepted view geologically now. So I think even as we look at this, it's like God is saying, because of the flood, I built the mountains, and because of the flood, I made the valleys. And even with the mountains, there's thoughts that as the continents kind of collided, it created these massive mountains like the Rockies. And I didn't get in this presentation, but there's also other thoughts around, well, how old are these mountains? And if these mountains are that old, why are they not eroded? Like, why are they not flat? Like, why did all the rainwaters not continue to wash them away? So a little bit about the flood, sedimentary rock, a few things. And now I'm going to shift gears a little bit. It's totally different because this is an area that I think is really fascinating. It's called what is irreducibly complex. So irreducibly complex. And this complexity is, I'm going to give you a quick example of what I mean by this. So if I had a mouse trap, for it to work, I need all the components to work together. Okay, so if I took out the wood, it's not going to work. If I took out that little wire on the top, it's not going to work. If I took out the hook on the bottom, it's not going to work. If I took out the little spring like paddle thing, it's not going to work. Like, you need all of the components to work together, which means that it's irreducibly complex. You have to have everything working simultaneously at the same time for it to work. You can't have one piece working by itself, okay? So what's a good example of that in biology? So this flagellum, if you've ever, seen that, it's a bacteria. It has this little kind of tail on it. That little tail wiggles, but it actually spins. That's kind of neat. But it has this motor, and this is actually a representation of it. And this motor is made up of molecules. Like, we think about motors nowadays, and to me it kind of looks like a drive shaft, and just like how the transmission in your car works. And if I were to be like, oh, if I saw this nowadays and looked at the transmission, I'd be like, oh, the transmission is modeled after this because this was built way first. But really, this flagellum is a irreducibly complex item. So each one of these things, there's a cap, there's a hook, there's a ring, there's a secondary ring, another ring, another ring. All these things are working and moving together. So, and they've done these experiments, and even I met with a scientist once who was actually studying these flagella, and they did what's called knockout experiments. And basically they said, we're going to take out the gene that's going to make this one piece. And by taking out that one piece, the whole thing stops working. And it's the same thing kind of all throughout. Like, you have to have everything coordinated and working together. And I think that's just an amazing piece of machinery that was designed, not just for bacterium, but even there's some cells in men that do this. So it's pretty cool. So some other things here with irreducibly complexity. There's these other proteins in your body, and if you ever took biochemistry, which I hope you never have to, it's not my favorite, but it was really interesting, and I learned a lot, and that's part of the reason why I'm a doctor. So thank you to my biochemist friends. But this is called the citric acid cycle, and this is an irreducibly complex system. And there's, if you want to go through them all, you could, but citrate, I'm just going to pick on citrate real quick, is a protein, and this protein helps to kind of make another molecule that then goes through the cycle and goes through the cycle. And as it goes through the cycle, we make our energy. So this is where our ATP comes from if you go back to biology. So it's our energy and our mitochondria that gives us our cells. So we just had a good breakfast. Now we're going to have more energy. This is where that energy went to. It's going to give us some extra pep in our step today. However, if I took out one of these proteins, the whole system dies. If I took out any one of them, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't work. Like, you're going to lose your energy. And so this is just another one of those amazing kind of things that work. And kind of give you an idea of, like, what are these proteins like. I wanted to kind of compare it, because this was something fascinating to me as I looked into some of these molecules. Because we look at proteins in nature are these massive things. Like, we just looked at that flagellum and how complicated that structure is. And proteins are about 50 to 100 times larger than, like, the medications we synthesize. Like, we synthesize all sorts of different things. And I'll show you kind of a comparison here in a second. But like, some of these proteins are so large that we can actually see them in microscopes. Like, here's an example of where these different proteins, you can actually map them out, and then these are like the 3D renderings of them with some computer sciences. And it's just amazing that they're so huge and complicated, but yet they work perfectly. Now, I talked about citrate synthase, that protein around citric cycle. This is a picture of that, again, a 3D representation of it. You can kind of see these bands as well, but it folds in on itself because it actually has two different things here. So this is what's called an open, and this is what's called closed. So you can kind of see that they're a little different. There's a little gap in here. And so that gap is perfectly designed for the chemical that we need for our energy to sit in and get modified, get cut or adjusted. And then when it's done, it changes the shape, and then it closes off. And then so it's an amazing structure in itself that it does its job perfectly. And it's made out of 437 amino acids, which, if you know, like, amino acids, this would be one. So this is tryptophan. So there's about 437, not tryptophans, but mixture of tryptophan and lysine and leucine and all these different ones. So it's this massive molecule that makes up this thing. Compare that to something like aspirin or Tylenol. You guys have probably had that for a headache. And these are how small these molecules are. Okay, and I think about that in medicine because, like, we're nowhere near what we can do with medicine. Most of the things that nowadays they're coming out with what's called biologics. So there's different medications, but they're modeled off of things that we already know about. Like, we're taking something like this and saying, well, what if I were to trim part of this or to adjust that? You can make them, but we're making them out of things we've already made that are already there. We're not saying, let's make something brand new, because this is so complicated that we barely understand it. But we can make Tylenol, something small. So to me, it's just an amazing structure. And here's just a few other structures I just wanted to highlight, just because I think it's just amazing. So these are a few other proteins that are there, and just again how perfectly designed they are. Like, they fit into different shapes. You can have ones in squares, you can have ones that have pores, you can have ones that open, you can have ones that close, ones that fit together in these like complements, and it's just again an amazing structural feat within our body, and these are just in our individual cells, and it's just incredible. And this here is fascinating, so I wanted to highlight because it's kind of fun. The largest protein in our bodies is called titin, and this actually helps with, this is actually your muscle fibers, and so as your muscle constricts, these actually will come together and separate, so these slide perfectly in and out, and this is what your muscle looks like. And so that titin actually sits kind of here in this area, but it's a massive molecule. So we talked about how that other one, that citric synthase, was like 400 and some, and this is 34,000 amino acids. This is just a huge molecule, and this is what the chemical formula looks like. So there's 169,719 carbon within that one molecule. So again, just huge in comparison to like Tylenol. It's got like 7. So again, super complicated. But the largest protein that we found is actually PKZILLA1. If you want to name it better, that would be great. But it's actually found in algae, which is also random, because as we think about like things that are not super complex, you're like, oh, those single cell organisms or algae or whatever, they're probably not very complicated. It's like, no, this actually has the largest like protein in the world that we know about. It's 45,000 amino acids, so it's even bigger than that one. So it's, again, like, why does algae need that? Yeah.
Was that actually named after Godzilla?
No, I don't know. It could be. I wouldn't put them past them. Those biologists are a little funny. So one of my favorite ones I didn't put up here is actually Sonic the Hedgehog gene. And that's actually in embryology. It's called, Sonic the Hedgehog gene. I don't know. Way to go, Sega. So And just to kind of give you a quick thing here too, I brought up that citric acid cycle, but these are just a quick mapping of all the different cycles that are happening in your individual cells. And they don't all happen at the same time, they happen at different times, but they're all needing these different proteins and chemicals and things, and it's just, even just to write it out is super complicated. So how complicated is the cell? As we look at one cell, there's over 1 trillion of them in your body. If you were to imagine it as a factory, so thinking about like the Amazon factory again, or warehouse, if you had a small town, you would have over 1 billion workers within that, or a multi-story building. and they perform highly coordinated assembly, transport, control quality, because your cell not only makes stuff, it checks. There's a checks and balances. They say, oh, that was incorrect, delete, and then they get rid of it. So there's lots of things that are integrated. How perfectly is this system? It's incredibly perfect. So if you looked at this other irreducibly complex system, is DNA, RNA, and protein. And now, what I talked about earlier about some of the things in the flood, there's explanations that are on that naturalistic worldview around things like how the sedimentary rock was formed and how these things happen. However, there hasn't been an explanation for this. They don't know how DNA, RNA, and protein work together so perfectly, and how were they formed. Like, we still have no way of generating life from non-life. And this is what this is really about. Everybody's kind of familiar with DNA by now, but DNA, it requires proteins for replication, but then the proteins require DNA and RNA for synthesis. So it's again kind of that chicken or egg thing, but this is actually worse than the chicken or egg, because you have to have both simultaneously. And so the scientists have been studying and saying, well, they've been able to make a few amino acids, which could lead to a protein. But again, if you can make 1 or 2 amino acids in a lab, but yet you need 434 of them just to make one protein, but now you need 25 proteins just to make one cycle of your cell, but then you need a few hundred or 1,000 of them to make your cell work. It's so complicated. We have no idea how that could even happen. So it's this origin of life barrier, that there's no known unguided mechanism for producing coding, and this symbolic system that is so perfect. So I want to tell you just, again, how complicated DNA is, just so you can understand this, because when Darwin came up with this theory of evolution, didn't understand the cell. He didn't understand DNA, and I think even in some of his words or other people early on in the theory of evolution, they were talking about how if the cell or the basic systems of life are too complicated, this isn't going to work. And I think as we know more, it's not going to work. And so as DNA, one, we think about it as a 2D. So just like if you know computer code, they use 1s and 0s. So everything in your computer that you do is a 1 and 0. So it's a binary code. This is a quaternary code, so it's actually 4 symbols. So you have A, T, C, and G. So you have bits, and if you were to label, to string it out in one human cell, it's about 12.8 billion bits, or 1.6 gigabytes of material. That's in one cell. Okay, and you can't even see a cell. Try to look at your hand and be like, okay, I want to look at one cell. It's holding that much material. So with the 2D, most people think that, okay, we're going to read a protein, we're going to start here and just read it left to right. And this is going to tell you what color your eyes are. And then you're going to read down a little further, and it's okay, this is what your skin color is. And then you're going to read down here a little further, and it's this is how tall you are. These all different things kind of give you this kind of book. People thought you start at one end, you just read it, and then that's what you are. That's not the case. What they found was DNA, that even just the 2D structure is so complicated. So here's a comparison. If you started at point 1, you could learn how to drive a car. Okay? You started 2 letters down, now you're going to learn how to bake a cake. And then you're going to go down 1 million down the road, and now you're going to read it backwards, and now it's going to perfectly tell you how to play golf. So these are just amazing comparisons, because not only are things happening in different directions at the same time, and they're starting at different points and telling different proteins what to be made, they're doing it simultaneously. It's happening thousands of times on the DNA, the RNA, the proteins are being synthesized thousands of times on the same DNA strand at the same time. So it's, again, super complicated, and that's just the 2D version. Okay, that's just, again, if I laid it out and I said, I'm going to read it this way, okay, I'm going to read here, read there. Could you imagine if you wrote a book and you said, okay, here's the Bible. We'll give the Bible. And it's like, okay, if you read it through the Bible, okay, now I'm going to delete the first letter, and now start reading on the second letter, and now it's the Quran. Like just because I deleted one letter is not going to change much in a book, but that's how close our DNA is. Like you can start just a few points away and it's going to change the entire protein synthesis. So hopefully that makes sense. I tried to explain it to Heidi and she thought that was a good analogy a little bit. So it helped. So, it helped. Yeah. However, DNA gets more complicated. Over the last few years as we've studied DNA, DNA is 3D. Okay, and here's an example of what I mean by that. So if you were to take one cell and then to string out the DNA, it's going to be about as tall as me. Okay, that's one cell. Like it's about 6 to 7 feet tall if you were to string it out in just one nucleus. However, it folds in on itself so amazingly that it gets down to 6 micrometers, which is just minuscule. It's ridiculously small. And so to do that, it has to fold and fold and wrap and wrap and wrap and wrap. So genes are not just raced or are read because of where they are. They're also read because of how it's folded. So the DNA itself can then fold in on itself, and then how it's folded will say, no, because I'm folded this way, I'm not going to read that code. And then it's going to change later, and then that shape is going to move, and then it's going to be, oh, now I'm going to read the code because I shifted the shape. And some examples of why this is important is because if things were to misfold, if that 3D area was gone, it could lead to cancer. It can lead to congenital malformations or developmental delays. Like that's how important this DNA folding is. But it gets even more complicated than that. So we talked about the DNA, 2D, now 3D, now 4D. So the fourth dimension is time. And this is regulatory timing. So this is precise control of onset of gene expression. So I mentioned like Sonic the Hedgehog gene. So an embryology is a great example of this. So as your embryo develops, first it just says, hey, replicate, just start making new cells. And then it starts making more and more cells. And then over time it says, okay, now make a liver cell over there. You guys over there make a liver. Okay, you guys over here make a brain. You guys over here make the toe. You guys over here make the heart. So it starts to differentiate based off the same genetic code because of the timing. And then it also says like how long you should express that gene, and then how intensity, like how much you should be producing. Like is it just a little bit, a lot? And then when should you stop? So again, this dynamic control system. So again, if you had a computer that just mimicked the DNA, like it'd be these quantum computing things like nothing. Because it's like, oh, we can store code in any direction. I can do it in this way and that way. I can change the timing. And a good example of how this works too is, let's say if you eat something you're not supposed to, let's say, and then your body needs to create something to kind of digest it, then it has to, again, upcode those things that are going to digest it. And so then you can do all these different things. So again, it's amazing as we look at the DNA where you look not just at the sequence that 2D says what can be made, the 3D sequence says what is accessible, and then the timing says when should I activate it. So again, more complicated than we could ever imagine. We don't have anything in our computer processing that even comes close. So I think with that, to me it says that God is our creator. And Psalms 139 says, I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works. Your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed, and in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me. And I think to me it's like, it's in your book, like, and you wrote their code for me. You know, just like as we look at the DNA, he didn't just write it thinking, this is probably what Kyle will look like. No, he specifically designed it just the way it should be. But I think the next thing as I think about creation is the Sabbath. I think in Genesis 2 and 3, God created rest. You know, by the seventh day, he had worked. He'd done all this stuff. I mean, just think, as I think about like the DNA sequence and as he created man and he etched it out of dirt, you know, it's like he put thought into it. Like he actually went down and said, this is something I want to be specific and designed. But then he said, I want to bless the seventh day to make it holy. And he rested on it from all the work that he had created. And I think it's important to think about, as we've been talking about lots of things in nature, how the Sabbath is actually unnatural or not natural. Because if you think about this, the Sabbath, it doesn't fit any known thing in nature. We look at days, and it's the rotation of the earth. We look at months, it can coincide with the moon. We look at years, the circle around the sun. But there's no phase in nature that says anything about Sabbath. It's something that is very unnatural. It's because it's a living monument of creation. It goes back in history as far as we can, and it's been tried to be changed by different secular worldviews. And it hasn't. This is the best fit for us, is the 7-day week, and the Sabbath is the end of that. And I think it's because the Sabbath is the evidence of design and time. It was established as the finish line of the first week before a single sin had ever been committed. It was established when the world was perfect. And I don't know about you, but I want to be as close to perfect as I can get. So I want to keep the Sabbath. And I think just like DNA is the code in ourselves, the Sabbath is the code written into our calendar to remind us where we came from. And just like that, in the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, it says God places his official seal. If you know anything about ancient seals, these seals had multiple things. It had who was writing it or who it was for, so the king's name, had their title, and what territory they ruled over. And in the Ten Commandments, it says, the Lord Jehovah is our creator, and then he made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. And so again, I think it points to that God is our creator, and he set the Sabbath there for us, so that we could remind ourselves that we are his creation. Because there's so many times in the Bible that it's over and over and over and over stated that he is our creator. And unfortunately, there's too many things in this world that are counterfeits. But I think that as we look at all of this science stuff, most of the things that we talked about have a counterfeit. And anything worth something has a counterfeit. Like, nobody counterfeits play money with other play money. Like, you're going to counterfeit a $100 bill, or you're going to counterfeit a $3 million painting. And it's like, and why is there all this stuff as we talk about the worldviews of creationists and materialism, these things around, like, where did the sedimentary rock come from, and how did fossils get formed? And to me, it's like, it's because Satan is fighting this battle with us, challenging us, and he's saying, that's not true. That's not how it happened. And he's constantly challenging us with a counterfeit. So I think we have to be careful as believers that God is our creator. And I think Genesis 1 and 2, a lot of people feel like it's not as important today. But if you just read those 2 chapters, it talks about God being our creator. It talks about the importance of marriage. It talks about the importance of Sabbath. It gives us the plan of salvation and how that Jesus is our only way to be saved. And it even talks about death. It talks about death is what's coming if we don't follow his plan. And I think it's incredible, just in the first 2 chapters, just read the first 2 chapters of the Bible, and you'll see these outlined for us. And I think that's important as we talk about these things, because we want to look at each one of these individually, and I want you to study them on your own, because I'm not going to do it in this series. But we are going to do one of them. We're going to talk about next time, what happens when you die? Am I good enough? And I think as we look at creation, it's a good segue into death. And looking at history, everybody's died before us, unfortunately, except for like 2 people. But if we think about it, death is coming. So do we want to be ready for it? Yes. So with that, let's have a quick word of prayer. Dear my Father, Lord, thank you so much for your creation. Thank you for today. Thank you for your design as we looked at it today. I love looking at your world and also just how you created my DNA to make me. And Lord, we just want to pray that you continue to bless the series and help people to come back on Tuesday night. And Lord, we just also want to pray for the cold. And if people are out in the cold, I know it can be a dangerous time for some. And Lord, we just thank you so much that we have a nice warm building, and continue to bless our families. In your holy name, amen. So with that, any questions out there based on what I talked about, or anything else?
So, yeah, I do have a question.
Yeah.
So for carbon 14,
Sorry.
it's not easily, so you go back to the slide where they used to come up with it.
This one?
Yeah. So if it's billions of years, you can only do this after the sun became things.
Yes. So carbon 14 is not usually used in rocks, it's usually used in like plants and animals to date them because you have to ingest the carbon-14 typically to do that. That's why rocks are using those other materials, like we talked about, polonium, uranium, argon, those things like that.
Just have to assume that there's sun.
Yes.
So before sun,
Yeah. Before the sun, yeah. So I think part of the thing I didn't mention, but there's a lot of, even just like with the polonium halos and things in granite, is that I think that God didn't create Adam and Eve as babies, and I think that he didn't create the world as a new world. Like he created it as old. Plus also, there's a lot of viewpoints that say that there was something here, because in Genesis 1, it talks about how the earth was without form and void. And so some of that could be tied to like, well, things look older than they are because there might have been something here beforehand,
well,
and he modified that.
I thought about like even if they did do dating or whatever, and it comes back as let's say millions of years or whatever. I mean, couldn't that really be true if if you're going on the creation standpoint, it was created, whatever. But like you said, there was something here already. So maybe millions of things could be true if it was here already.
Yeah, I think to an extent, I think.
Yeah. Right. First thing, for sure.
Yeah. I think the carbon-14 is useful within like thousands of years, I would say, but not so much further than that.
So they're not going to be
No. Anything else? Becca? Every animal went on the ark. Yep, all the animals that we see today had some ancestor on the ark. Except for maybe the water animal.
Yeah, that's one other thing that I think is really fascinating because, it rains, right, and it's fresh water. And so somehow, some way, the animals who need the salt water to support their body systems miraculously was able to survive. And the animals that need fresh water for their body systems were miraculously able to survive. So I think that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think the water animals probably had an ark of their own. The water ark, the water aquarium or something.
Yeah.
It's amazing when some survived and some didn't survive. Larger ones, unfortunately, didn't survive, except for being such few.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if it was over the entire earth, it could support, and then as it, dissipated, I mean, not all the animals can, so some are left on dry land to.
Yeah, they've definitely, it's an extinction event, and there was also, Ellen White talks about how that there was larger animals that did become extinct because they couldn't survive in the environment, or over long periods of time. And as the people changed, it didn't feel like that was still right. So there's quotes there. Yeah.
So aside from all the complexity of the DNA and all that is, we can't even think how to do it. The thing is, if you were in the emergency room and you had this perfect body that for some reason the heart stopped. So you try to shock, and most of the time they don't revive. And there are a few times that they do revive. But how can something that's not even formed live when this thing that is already formed and has been living now is not living, and then you try to make it live? The miracle of life itself is a proof that there's a God, because we can't even create life.
No, even if we could create one cell of just the materials, it doesn't mean that it's going to work perfectly together. Yeah. Yeah. Very true. Yeah.
One thing I've heard is some scientists will talk about, like the Chicks book crater, for example, it supposedly, I think it was tens of millions of years ago, and it left a big ring of ash around the world. And they found this in all different parts of the world. So, that was like an interesting event. The theory goes, they found like certain fossils underneath it, and they find different fossils above it. And so it just seems like like I agree, this evidence does seem to support like a more quicker process for laying down all the sediment. But I don't know. Sometimes to me, I just found it hard. It seems like there's good evidence on like both sides. I don't know. I guess, do you have any thoughts on like how to figure it out? It's hard to figure out the whole.
No, it is. It is very hard to figure out, and you know, I think as I process some of this stuff, and even as I read about it, I try to look at what is the other side's viewpoint on this, and yeah, I think both sides don't have it figured out either, and I think you know, like you mentioned the crater from like asteroids and things, and then even looking at some of the sedimentary rocks, like there's in the video they talk about how there's one layer that's in the Grand Canyon, and about 80 miles away there's not this layer and that one, so then why are these two layers not there? And they come at it from a creationist viewpoint, and then other people come at it from a more naturalist viewpoint. And I think that theories do change over time too around how do we fit those things, but I think both are coming at it with a worldview perspective, and so it's kind of hard to like figure it out, you know. And I think even just like the Grand Canyon is a good example where for, you know, a long time people thought, well, this was, all these things were brought up by millions of years, and then it was carved out over millions of years by the slow erosion of the river, and now that's kind of against even the naturalist worldview because they're like, no, there was these big lakes that washed it out, and so I think it is hard to kind of figure out like what's right in some of those questions, but I think it's good to ask those questions and just kind of see what views are out there. Because even just like my analogy of the cup in the back, it's like I don't know how it got there, but I can have 80 different reasons as to why, and then we have to kind of figure out what's the evidence behind it and what makes the most sense. So I don't have a great answer, and but I think that's the fun part of science, though. Science is the idea of studying something we don't have an answer to, and you just kind of have to keep digging deeper. So, good question, though. I wish I had a better answer. All right. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.